All right, it is now 11:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a good 40 people participating, and for those that join us after this, welcome to everyone. I just wanted to say happy National Mentoring Month. We're now entering the middle of the month, and it's been really exciting and a great mentoring month so far. So hopefully you felt that and seen that and enjoyed that. And I just wanted to say that thank you all for joining for our second webinar celebrating National Mentoring Month. My name is Brady Burns, and I'm the Digital Communications Strategist for the National Research Mentoring Network. And our presenters today are Doctors Antentor Hinton Jr. and Haysetta Shuler. They're here to talk to you today about how to be an effective mentor for underrepresented STEM trainees. So please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the NRMN YouTube channel. And if you're not already signed up for our newsletter, please do that. You can find that by visiting our website. It's nrmnnet.net. And during the course of our presentation, we have a Q&A open, so feel free to post your questions there. And we will allow time at the end of our presentations to answer those questions live with our presenters. So without further ado, please welcome our panelists, Dr. Antentor Hinton Jr. and Haysetta Shuler.
So good morning and thank you for having us. We really appreciate the warm welcome. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this is the last talk of the series for the National Mentor and Research Network's mentoring series. Of course, they have other events. We hope that you attend the other events that are listed in the calendar. And this is, next slide, please. This is an appreciation for several different things. One is to recap really quickly what we talked about last time, and also discuss about how all of the seminars that we've done up until this point, whether they've been career development or mentoring seminars, how they can be used as skill sets and tools to actually empower how to mentor effectively. So last time we talked about what a mentor is and what a mentee is and their roles, and then the types of mentoring that can occur. And then we also talked about STEM outreach and then how to be an effective STEM outreacher, if you will. And next slide, please. But today we'll be spending our time on good mentoring. So in general, we'll be talking about how to motivate individuals and support them at the same time. And then also how to provide support in the context of empathy. And that was kind of an example of this is emotional intelligence. So we'll be talking about that through the talk. And the last one, will weave into the talk. So we won't spend a lot of time on cultural competence. You'll have to actually check check us out another time to do that. But also I want to suggest that you spend looking some time at some of Dr. Angela Byers' papers because she does a lot of things related to cultural competence and cultural competence awareness mentoring. And so just to give everyone an understanding of what cultural competence is, just in case you're not aware of this, cultural competence is the awareness of knowledge and skills needed to work with others who are culturally different from self in meaningful, relevant, and productive ways. So an example of this is to look at someone from multiple perspectives. You can see someone's language, their beliefs, their priorities, values, and culture. And this is what it kind of encompasses cultural competence. So throughout the talk, we'll talk about motivation mostly and empathy or emotional intelligence when we're pointing it as the bigger phrase. But we want you to be aware of that. Think in the context of how when you are mentoring in the laboratory or mentoring in, out in, at a conference or a one-on-one in Zoom or multiple individuals on our group mentoring session, think about how individuals are different and how we can celebrate those differences through having proper mentoring with motivation and then also emotional intelligence. Next slide, please. So as we think about good mentoring, there is another side that we like to coin negative mentoring. The reason that we coin it negative mentoring, next slide, is because sometimes there are challenges that occur based upon not having the right cultural competence skill set to empower the mentor to be able to be effective at good mentoring. Next slide, please. So one thing we want you to think about is that how could cultural competence, how could you be aware of using motivation, and how could you be aware of using emotional intelligence to impact your mentoring so that we don't have to worry about negative mentoring? Or if things start to arise, how you can actually perceive them as ineffective mentoring and use these strategies to empower yourself to become a better mentor and more well-rounded. Next slide, please. So today's talk is mostly about good mentoring. So what is good mentoring? Next slide, please. Good mentoring, like we said in the previous presentation, is about, next slide, please, is about altruistic honesty and trustworthiness. It's also about promoting and active listening, and a lot of the other strategies that we covered last time. But we do not know what types of good mentoring strategies are effective at mentoring people. So next slide, please. We believe from some literature researches that we've done that good mentoring is starting with actually keeping someone to be able to be motivated. So what is motivation? It's okay if you don't have the next slide. I've memorized the slides. It's quite okay. Go back one slide, Bradley. Sorry, not Bradley, Brady. Sorry, I apologize. So the slide is what is motivation, which should be the one that's next. So motivation is defined as the inner drive to excel. And this inner drive is also important for creating a condition that wishes, desires, or cultivates goals, and then move on a particular direction or behavior to accomplish this plan. So if we think about it, in the cartoon that you're not seeing right now, over to the right, I'll describe it for you. It would be two individuals that have a little rope between them. And one person's looking and they're like on a little cliff, and the other person's not on a cliff. And so what's interesting about this drawing is this is what motivation is like at its essence. Motivation is where you're reaching out to an individual that's not too far away from you, and you're helping them through a situation. And this particular situation is a little extreme, but there are situations in the laboratory that we face constantly where individuals need help. Sometimes it's just as simple as troubleshooting. But troubleshooting, when you're not familiar with the technique or you're frustrated, you have to think about what's there. So motivation has to be also the ability to help others organize their basic needs. Sometimes when an individual is deprived of eating or sleeping or thinking or resting, because they're so focused on their science, they're not able to think about how to properly align themselves and organize themselves to do something. So in the context of cultural competence, what does it mean to be a motivational mentor or have an inspirational quote to be able to push someone to do something correctly or effectively? Well, if you take this picture at the bottom, this is actually the first African American to climb Mount Everest. And what's interesting about this is that I'm pretty sure she had a lot of internal conflict and a lot of external conflicts. But one thing that we can provide when we're looking at cultural competence is asking the question about how I would do this, how would they do this? And then how would my awareness of these situations align with the intersections that are available based upon her belief system, her values, her culture, her priorities, and then also her language. So each of these things does impact motivation and also impacts how we are able to effectively mentor. Additionally, the situation, yes, that's good. The next slide's fine. So additionally, as a mentor, we also have to provide motivation to the trainee. So it's important to think about how psychological forces govern a mentee's actions to do certain things, or a trainee, we'll use those words interchangeably for the rest of the time, and also the direction at which we can push someone to behave in a certain manner with the right decorum in the context of a social setting for science. So we have to be careful about how we mentor, because we ourselves have the ability to empower someone to do great things, but also negative things if we're not careful. So this is why we always want to stop and think about, okay, this individual is made up of a culture, a value, priorities, beliefs, and language, but how can I motivate this individual? I'm going to ask Dr. Shuler to give an example using me. So we're going to say I am a African-American male that's 32, that has a family and has a degree in cell biology and has a faculty position. But the task here now is to mentor me as a trainee. Just because I'm an assistant professor doesn't mean that I know everything. So I seek out advice from older colleagues. And so I would love for Dr. Schuler to come on in and talk about the context of how to motivate an individual to push out the best of them, to have the level of grit, to have the perseverance and the attitude that's needed to go towards a goal. And I guess the goal that I would be wanting to go towards is writing a grant or reviewing a grant. So how could I be, how if I'm down about this, how could you get me to be more motivated to do this task, Dr. Schuler, if you don't mind?
No, I don't mind, and thank you. And good afternoon to everyone, and welcome again. Okay, I am the person that would love to give definitions so we can be on the correct understanding or the same understanding. So I would start off with this task by first defining what is motivation. So I'm going to go in the simplest form and then move forward. So we define motivation as the reason or reasons why you're doing something. So in Dr. Hinton's case, he's wanting to write a grant. So now I need to look at what is the desired level of you wanting to write a grant. So using weight for an example, let's say if you want to lose weight to get healthy, that is just one example of motivation. So now for me as the motivator, I am going to look into seeing how I can be of value in giving him direction, being persistent, and also, there may be times when I may have to take that persistence up into a very intensified level because we're working now with deadlines. So, where am I going to start first? First, I'm going to start again by asking AJ why you're wanting to write the grant. Then, number two, I'm going to ask him, have you thought about the time and the effort that is going to take you to write the grant? Do you have the necessary help in order for you to write this grant? And then we're going to put out a schedule, and I am going to be the person that is going to give him positive feedback very frequently. Even when he's made a mistake or I see something that's wrong in the grant, I'm going to give him that critique and let him know that I believe you need to rewrite this or consider rewriting this particular portion right here, because the end game is for you to not only write the grant, but also to have a better chance of getting it an award for this for the grant. So as the motivator, I'm going to often give him positive feedback. I'm going to often support his belief as a mentee. That is where I also need to understand cultural competency, where I'm going to be able to use his values and his beliefs to also motivate him to be persistent, to go forth and to give his best. Next slide. Okay, so as I said before, everyone who is a motivator has a different set of skills and abilities, and they're all unique because each mentee is different. So when we're talking about culture competency and motivation at the same time when mentoring, it is very important that we start with cultural competency and learning the beliefs and understanding and honoring the histories of that mentee. And also, we have to go past that and understand, especially if our mentees have children, and we have to take consideration into their values in raising their children. And everyone have different values. It's just that we as the mentor have to be aware, or we should become aware of the diversity and cultural competency with each mentee. Taking that into consideration, now it helps set up a roadmap for you as a mentor to help motivate that student, because what may motivate one particular mentee may not be the motivational factor for another mentee. So it takes us to get, it's almost like starting a relationship, getting to know that individual, having respect for your differences, even though you're the mentor and you have a mentee, everyone is different. And so that's why I say mentoring has to be intentional. You have to be willing to be able to learn things about yourself as well as the other person. Then you make the decision before you even go into a contract of whether or not you think you're a good fit to mentor this particular student. And if not, don't be afraid to refer the student to another individual. That's a good way to build a network. So, inspirational motivation, as I've already gone into that previously, again, we as mentors, we must be inspired from within because it's 100% noticeable when we're mentoring because we've been told to versus because we desire to. When we desire to mentor, it's always about being intentional. It's always about you investing into the future. That is my core belief in mentoring. I am investing into the future. How I mentor my mentee is going to have an impact and is always going to be a positive impact into the future. How are you so bold to say that, Dr. Schuler? Because as the kids say now, the fruit speaks. And when I know that I do not have the character or what that mentee needs, I again will always recommend someone else to take the role. And so what inspires me to be a mentor is because it is an investment. It is because this is a way that I can make some kind of contribution, not only at the school, but in society and one day, hopefully, to the world. And so, what are the characteristics that the mentor must have in the role that he plays in his or her mentee's life? One, I believe that mentoring have to you have to listen, be inspired to listen. Active listening is just as important as intentional mentoring. You have to active listen. That means you set aside time to speak with your mentee and pay attention to what he or she has to say. Be active instead of passive. And then what do you do when you listen? Okay, I may not have the answer to the situation, but I can always seek out advice from my network before giving advice to make sure I'm giving the best advice. And how do we provide effective listening? I just said that before. Being intentional, repeat what the mentee had just said. So one of the things I love to do is to say, just to clarify, you're saying X, Y, Z. And the mentee will either confirm or say, no, I really didn't mean that. And we get more clarity before I give a response. Next slide. Again, making eye contact with your mentee. This is something that I strive with students, whether I'm mentoring them or not. I make sure that when we're talking, there's eye contact. Why, Dr. Schuler? Because that shows confidence. I believe in you. I see the potential in you. Why are you holding your head down? Why are you looking to the side? Just like when we ask students those questions, we need to make sure we're not doing the opposite of what we're asking them to do. Because students that we serve come from different backgrounds, and those backgrounds can be from being inferior to being those of confidence. And there's a difference. If you've been in education, you know the difference right away. So I make sure I have eye contact with my mentees. And again, when we're separating time to observe our mentees, that's just like having a child. I'm giving my child or my spouse or my mother, my father, I'm giving them attention without any distractions, meaning that I'm not going to speak to another mentee while I'm talking to this particular one. I'm not going to answer my phone. I'm not going to um, log into another Zoom session. I'm not going to write. I'm going to give that mentee my attention without any interruptions. And so again, I believe that you must have a open mindset as a mentor. You cannot have a tunnel vision. Again, because we working in areas now that students, just because we're in a certain setting, the type of students that you bring in are always changing. They may be the same color, they may come from the same socioeconomic background, they may come from the same school systems, but they're all individual and they're all different. So that's how I look at my mentees. I do not put them in categories by race, by gender, by sex, by socioeconomic backgrounds, or by major. I put them in a place of being a human being, and take my time to get to know that individual. So I do not have a fixed mindset, what I call a tunnel vision. Go to the next slide, please. Okay.
So what's interesting about this slide is that Dr. Schuler alluded to it, that you cannot have a fixed mindset. And I also wanted to recap the importance of going back to our previous presentations and listening to them so that you can get a more well-rounded understanding of mentorship. This particular set of slides, we pulled one from a talk that was talking about the trials and tribulations of graduate school, and we did it with another individual, Dr. Melanie McReynolds from Princeton University. And the reason that we did this particular talk with three people was to actually show the different perspectives and the dynamics that change when you're going to graduate school. And so it's just to demonstrate that although we may be of a particular ethnic background, each one of our experiences is different. So this is why it's so important not to put everyone in one fixed mindset. And that's the importance of cultural competence. When you actually use the techniques of cultural competence, thinking in mind as a person, as an individual, and not focusing on all of their other categories, but including them in the concept of how you train that individual, it will improve your understanding of that individual and how they're able to work and what will make the individual work at the optimum level that he, she, or they can. And it also creates a better working environment for everyone that's in your laboratory or everyone that you're managing within a department, because now you're able to see how to make a work environment much better. And then I'll get back to that point in a second about individual versus working environments. And then also, when you're having a fixed mindset, you're not able to provide the best perspectives, because sometimes problem solving has to come up with more than one outcome. Just like if you're troubleshooting a Western blot for an antibody, it could be that, the antibody's not directly binding. It could be that, you didn't denature the protein correctly. There's a lot of other options, or it could be that you need to use a harsher condition for your buffers. So there's a lot of different things that you can come up with as perspectives that could be solved. But you have to be able to have that growth mindset where you're constantly asking questions about what is unique about the situation. Let me develop a plan that's going to work for this set of circumstances. And then the next time when something arises, you'll be able to have more of a better outcome because you have better performance, because you're thinking not in a static way. Also, this helps other employees to be productive as well. The stronger that an individual is a part of a team, the ones that you may perceive once before as weaker, but if they have the right motivation, the right training from the mentor in the context of cultural competency, they're going to boost their morale at work, and they're going to improve, and they're going to increase their performance. Also, it's been shown that with a growth mindset, you can improve relationships between individuals, and then also demonstrate how that can increase your network. And then lastly, when you reduce your overall focus on a fixed mindset, you're able to reduce complaints and grievances, because you're able to perceive how something may cause an issue, or how something that you say or a nonverbal action that you have impacts an individual. So then this way, you're able to have a better, more inclusive environment, and it allows for you to do the right thing more often. And so one thing that I want to say with cultural competency in the context of this is a quote from Thomas Paine, which is still relevant, even though this slides from another presentation. What's fascinating about this is Thomas Paine says, "What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." So this is something that's important. You have to give a mentee the ability to grow. And if they're in a constant state of fixed mindset or static mindset, you cannot use cultural competency techniques to empower them or motivate them. So it actually has to come down to a dynamic relationship, multiple sit downs. And when you're enforcing this cultural competency, training, you'll be more self-aware. You'll have a cultural understanding of the individual's backgrounds, and then also all the individuals' backgrounds that you interact with. And then you'll also have multiple perspectives to choose from, and you'll be able to actually clarify when you're listening what he or she or they is saying, and if you can actually relay that message back in an effective way. Next slide, please. Also, with cultural competency, you'll be able to focus more on the situation, and you'll know what they're saying, and you're able to understand intercultural communication. So now that you have the skill set of listening, you're now going to be listening not only for what you perceive, but also what the mentee perceives at the same time. And then also combining it with empathy, which is something that we'll talk about in a second, which is in the realm of EQ and not sympathy, you'll be able to build stronger relationships and have more flexibility and adaptability in how you mentor. In other words, you don't have to be a MacGyver and fix every little thing that comes to play. Sometimes you just have to listen to the individual and be okay with that, and have them say that, look, I am here for you. I have empathy for your situation. I understand what's going on. And when I don't understand, sometimes you can use your cultural competence to seek out other individuals that may be in a multicultural organizational network to help you develop those skill sets, meaning that what Dr. Shuler said is not only accurate, but is so culturally competent, meaning that let's say a mentee has a situation where he or she may have some need of a skill set not have or Dr. Shuler may not have, but in our network, we can reach out to an individual to help develop that. And then that's allowing for you to have more intercultural facilitation and being able to solve that conflict that has arose in deficit of skill sets. And you'll be able to address that. And you'll now have access over time because you're not forcing to fix the situation when you don't have that skill set. And it's not going to cause an issue with the individual. Next slide. This is the beginning of how you serve for an individual. And remember, serving is allowing yourself also to be served, meaning that sometimes you have to realize that you're not going to only be the one that is giving the advice. That's why we talked about the mentorship in the context of reverse mentorship, because with reverse mentorship, sometimes your mentee is teaching you things, and it's actually okay, because that's the process of learning and the process of also listening and being able to have humility. When you're able to practice that, you're also reviewing the essentials of what cultural competency is and how you're employing that to your mentorship. Because if you're not able to effectively listen and serve other individuals by also not being the expert on someone's culture and taking a backseat and embracing what other aspects of humanity has to offer from just not your perspective, you will be a much more well-rounded individual. Can you go to the next slide, please, Brady? And then also, I would like to give the example of how can I share and focus. So earlier, everyone saw that I actually said Brady's name wrong. I said Bradley. And I wanted to make a point of that. There was a reason for that. Well, with mentors, you can make a mistake and you have to focus in on that mistake and you have to acknowledge it. When you acknowledge that mistake, then you can actually share back to the mentee and say, hey, look, I made a mistake. I have transparency. And this is the key part of cultural competency. It's not only about the mentee sharing, but it's also about you sharing. Sometimes when you're mentoring, it doesn't take much. You can say maybe one or two things about your day. Maybe at your house, you have to get ready for a dinner later on. So that's something that you can share with your mentee. That's creating a openness about a relationship. You don't have to tell them everything about your life, but it allows for you to break down barriers of communication that normally would not be there. And then also you're allowing the mentee to pay it forward and how they're going to be able to practice mentorship amongst their peers, which is another technique that we learned about in the last presentation, which is where people at the same level are entering some type of communication and helping each other to be sharpened. And lastly, I also wanted to say when you focus and you're able to share, you're able to open yourself up to different types of media and technology to carry out conversations. Because a lot of times now we think about virtual mentoring, something that we talked about in the previous presentation about a paper, and it's not a new concept. It's just the fact that we have to realize that during the 21st century, we face challenges. And sometimes the mentorship that we have has to be different. Next slide. So when you're mentoring in a circumstance that you do not know about, you have to have reconstruction of your thought process to think positively. If you notice in the background of that picture, there's an X over negative. So we have to be able to have daily reflection about what has happened when we're giving mentorship advice And when we're also identifying areas that we think that are negative in a mentee's situation or perspective, and we actually have to address them formally in a way that allows for us to be able to push through those belief systems that they may have and communicate effectively with them in a different way. And sometimes, even when you have cultural competence training, you have to reset because sometimes the situation where you're mentoring the mentee, it's not effective. So you have to try different strategies. So that is why we have to uniquely mentor individuals with motivation, and only the motivation that's going to be specific to them. Because if we do not, we're not allowing ourselves to be able to manage cultural diversity in the workplace. And it's so important. And as we talk about different perspectives about this, it's important to remember, next slide, please, that when you're thinking about possibilities and being able to think positively, we have to be grateful, and we have to practice being grateful because it's not a natural skill that we have. We're constantly, as human beings, being selfish and focus on our outcomes, but we have to focus on other individuals' outcomes as well, because during mentorship, remember, it's kind of almost like an apprenticeship from back in the example in the day when Telemachus was being mentored by Mentor, and also Athena when Athena dressed up as Mentor. So it's very important to realize that not only can men mentor men, but women can mentor men, and they both can do it effectively. But also remember that we have to think about things in the context of being proactive and positive. Because if we're not proactive and positive with our mentorship, we're not going to be able to have the best effective communication and team building that are true strong aspects about cultural diversity and cultural competence in the workplace. And then also, we're not going to be able to think about how to be able to be lenient on individuals' schedules and their timing and things that they're needed outside of their work or the workplace to be effective at doing the practices of science. Next slide, please. As I transition to the next slide, it's important to be our authentic selves. On the last slide, I talked about humor. And I love being funny. I love laughing. And I also love being self-aware about things, about when I'm trying to make an individual laugh. And so in the ability of cultural competence, it's very important to think about cultural incapacity. So cultural incapacity is the inability to work with diverse populations. So when you're thinking about how to phrase your humor, you have to be aware that sometimes your humor that may be dry and funny to you is not dry and funny to others. And it's usually made up where the intention is to ignore issues or promote policies and standards that are not adverse and that are not diverse, and they impact minorities or women and I guess in a very bad light. And then also in the context that it's not practicing the standards of what cultural competence can be. But if we practice the standards of cultural competency through our authentic selves, we're able to be more self-aware about other individuals' humor, for example, or other individuals' needs, and we're able to give them more open feedback. It's always important to be honest about what you do, but it's how you phrase things and when you word things that's the most important. Also, when you're learning about yourself, you also are being more authentic. So give yourself space to learn about yourself and review and reflect on the things that are different now that you're being more culturally aware. And so also give yourself time to journal. As mentors, I would highly suggest you journal or make thoughts about, at least on some type of piece of paper or on the computer, if you don't want to write it down, about what's changed as you start to be more aware about individuals' case by case mentorship needs. And then also when you're gauging potential. And I also want to tell you this, that being authentic means that you don't gauge an individual's potential by IQ or EQ, but you allow them the space to grow. And one thing, as we allude to when we get to the next section, is EQ, because EQ allows for you to grow continuously and you're able to improve those skill sets, what actually allows you to have a better work performance. And again, when you're doing that, you have cultural competency. And remember, cultural competency also when you're promoting cognitive, behavioral, philosophical, social and communicative skill sets that allow for one to have a cultural generational context. So these things are very important. And then also, please keep in mind that when we're doing cultural competence, we have to think inwardly first. Always think about how what you're saying could impact your mentee or how it could affect your colleague, and then look outwardly at the world and see how other individuals perceive those things about your mentee or your peer mentee that you're interacting with on a daily basis. And also live in the moment, embrace the moment. Next slide. Be authentic at all times. Don't worry about not trying to be the best individual that you can. It'll be natural because you're being authentic. You don't have to embrace things that are not you. But in the context of cultural competence, that's the part that's unsettling and sometimes a little difficult to do. You have to make a value based choice that's going to impact not only you, but also your mentee. So celebrate the differences in your laboratory, celebrate the differences that you see at conferences, and maintain your confidence and your courage to do those things, because with cultural competence training there's a lot that can be discovered, and also can allow for you to transition your motivational mindset and mentoring into the practice of having proper emotional intelligence. Next slide. Dr. Shuler, could you talk a little bit about the importance of emotional intelligence? um, uh, well, maybe.
I'm sorry, I was
Okay.
muted. I was trying to figure out why I'm not getting any feedback. I'm sorry, guys.
That's quite okay. I was just gonna go in and start. Go right ahead.
Okay, and thank you, AJ, for that thought well put together information on what you was talking about with mentoring and being authentic. I think that is so important as well. So, yes, you all, when we talk about emotional intelligence, a lot of people sometimes come and think it's something very big and it can't be, it's some kind of psychology mindset that you can't do, it's not necessary. Well, I beg to differ because emotional intelligence is all about being aware of your own the way you give feedback, the way you connect with people. It's a self-awareness and sensing of how others may perceive you. Now, most of us, especially mentors that have been in the field for a moment and who have a tunnel vision, we're not going to go into emotional intelligence without a fight, because it's about self-awareness. And to measure your emotional intelligence, not only do you make an assessment, but those close to you will also make the same assessment, or and you would probably be surprised as to how others see you. And so when those who push back on it find out how the benefits of it, is more embrace, because we all have an ability to have some type of bias that we may not be aware of. It's easy to say that, oh, I am not this or I am not that because I have done this and at one time I've done that. And my parents, they used to do this, but that is not a way to respond. Anytime I come up to that type of response or encounter that, it's a defense. You don't have to be on the defense. When you're on the defense, it's just usually because there's some type of denial. And usually when there's a denial, there's some type of lack of awareness. So being aware of your emotional intelligence, how you're perceived by others, can only make you a better mentor. And how is that? Because I've had my students to assess me. I and a set of my friends, we're very close. We take self assessments every year, sometimes twice a year. And one of those assessments is about emotional intelligence. Sometimes constructive feedback, the truth, it hurts, but it only hurts to make you better. So I think it's important as a mentor that you not only learn or become aware how others perceive you in whatever situation, that you address those, especially if they're negative, especially if it's an area that can only make you better. Why not? Why push back against it? Why not empower yourself so you can not only become a better person, you're a better mentor, and now because you are better in your areas of weakness, they now become strengths, and now you can become an effective mentor to your mentee. And you pass the same information along on to your mentee. Why? Because it's all about building a network. My goal is to always have a mentee, but to at one point, I have a set time where I'm going to push my mentee out, and they are now going to pay it forward by becoming a mentor. So having your emotional intelligence, knowing where they are, it's just only going to make you a better person. And again, it gives you an inspiration that now that you have taken a weakness and made it into a strength, it should only inspire you. It should only inspire you to be better, because now you can manage your emotions. What person on this earth does not want to manage their own emotion? What person on this earth does not, especially when you're in education, does not want to do better and come across and communicate better to their students with clarity, being concise, being precise, being effective? Who doesn't want that? We all want to be better, no matter what we're doing, whether it's mentor, mentee, whether it's been a parent, whether it's been a friend, whether it's been a sibling. We all should be aware of our emotions and learn how to manage them, and learn how others see us and how well we interact with others. That is so important in any type of relationship. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Dr. Hinton here has given you a little concept background of emotional intelligence, which I'm just going to allow you all to read that. And again, we have several tests here that you can actually use, or assessments that you can use, but there are many more. And I encourage you guys to just Google, because there is a unlimited amount of assessments that can be given out. I would say that you may want to read over how the assessments were actually, assessment is scored. And you also want to make sure that whichever assessment that you choose is appropriate for your audience and appropriate for yourself. Because we know, those who are in research know, that scoring, the validity and reliability of a test is just as important as the results of the test. So let's make sure we choose a good one. Next slide.
So with emotional intelligence, I just wanted to comment, and I'll give it back to Dr. Shuler in 1 second. I did want to bring to your attention that with cultural competency, there's one point that I almost forgot, and I wanted to bring it into play. Cultural competency also means importance with language. So sometimes hand gestures, as an example, if we're using the thumbs up, which we all do, sometimes in West Africa, the thumbs up is insulting, or in Western Asia, insulting. But in the context of the US, UK, Canada, it's a sign of approval, or even in Australia. Another example of this is kind of the horns. Like you put your fingers together, and then you're doing horn fingers, kind of like when you're at a rock concert. It's something that we've adopted in the US, but in other parts, it actually is a way to tell that your wife is cheating on you. And so it's something that we have to be kind of aware of. And that's why we have to think about cultural competence, because even just the simple symbol as the okay, where you're taking your index finger and your thumb finger together, it means okay to us, simply saying it's an indication of satisfaction. And that's usually in places that were previously either colonized or by the UK, such as like Australia or Canada, or the US even. But in other places, the OK sign can be offensive, like in Brazil or in Japan, in the context of certain situations. And so we have to be very, very careful about how we're using the symbol and how other people perceive the symbol, because it could really have an impact on the way that we do things. And in Japan specifically, it means money. And so we all have to think about how we're starting to do things and why we care about others' practices, because that allows for us to be more aware and make a safe zone for everyone. Because when we're making a safe zone for everyone, we're practicing those cultural competences. And remember that there's nothing wrong with having diversity. Diversity within certain populations, let's say if we took healthcare populations, so patient populations, isn't limited to race and ethnicity, but it's also expanding in the context that we may have people that are the same race but don't speak the same language. And that is very important. And we also get into the context of sexual orientation or ability or disability. We all have to think about all these multiple factors. They are very challenging to think about, but using the emotional intelligence guides that we provide you are very important. There are resources. So when you're seeing these slides, if you also, again, like Dr. Shuler said, Google Goldman, Google Soloway and Mayer, you can actually see their different tests that are associated with their core competencies. I also want to point out to you that as we wrap up, there is going to be some, next slide, please. There's going to be more slides that are in the background to go into the context of emotional intelligence that we won't have time to cover, but you can go to the next slide. But I wanted to give you extra slides that you could actually refer back to so that you're aware of things. But just in general, I'm going to wrap up in the next 2 minutes so we can take a lot of questions and kind of, dive into things better so we can be respective of the hour. But basically, emotional intelligence or EQ, there's not one that's better. And you have to stop thinking of them in the enemy context. I've heard some individuals do that, and I used to do that as well until I really educated myself on emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is very important. Next slide, please. And you have to think of emotional intelligence as a way to integrate abilities from individuals and perceive them, and also perceive how you receive things. What's interestingly put together by Travis Bradby in his Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book, and also what he said in the when he wrote for Forbes, he said that people with the highest levels of intelligence outperform those with average IQs just 20% of the time, while people with the average IQs outperform the high IQs 70% of the time. And that's because they're incorporating emotional intelligence, the cues that are around them. So we have to be aware of that. We cannot look at an individual and perceive them based upon an IQ examination, a GRE test, or some type of outcome that could be measured by what we perceive as potential. Emotional intelligence can fill in that gap, and it can be something that can continuously grow. What I also find very interesting is that Travis also said that the link between EQ and earnings is the direct point where it increases up to $1,300 in an annual salary. That's a lot of money when you're thinking about things. That's the same as dispersal of the check that's going around for the United States right now. Next slide, please. So what's interesting from this slide that I want to point to everyone is that EQ is what's usually required in top performers. 90% of the top performers have some level of EQ, and that 58% of the job performance is impacted by EQ. So this would suggest, next slide, that EQ is very important, and it can allow for you to perceive these individual items that are listed below, and they help you to be able to be more balanced in your personal life and in your workforce. Next slide. And then also, I just want to keep in mind, here are some resources that everyone can write down in the context of Daniel Goleman's literature. He's published a lot of different books, and he goes into talking about self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. I'm going to go to the next slide so that you all can have this captured in the video when you look at it. But we're going to end our talk here, and then you can go to the next slides just so that everyone can get a glimpse at all of the slides that are in the presentation. But I want everyone to be aware that it's broken down into core competencies. So you have these 5 categories, and then you also have core competencies made up of 20 competencies within each section. So for example, if we took motivation, which we heavily talked about today, is that motivation is moving towards an achievement or a goal. Up under motivation, these competencies are the drive to do it, the commitment of an individual or a group to obtain those goals, initiative, and optimism of setback and obstacles that are faced. So this means that how we do this is being able to set up an IDP plan that we talked about earlier very briefly, and actually organize the goals that are going to be specifically enriched by motivation. So now you can take your emotional intelligence platform and skills and tool sets that you now have, and you can actually ask the mentee in their individual development plan, can you identify some things that you think that you should be more self-aware of in the context of science? What do you think that you could improve in the context of management? That's self-regulation. where can I help you to be more influential in your research? And then also, when you actually do an IDP plan, you can also incorporate networking, which will incorporate the social competencies, which will be empathy and then also social skills. And the reason that these are important is because this allows for individuals to be able to see who you are, and you're also able to perceive what's happening in other individuals' lives, whether it's feelings, the needs of an individual, or concerns. And then also social skills allow for one to network and to be able to have the ability to influence others and also have clear communication. So it's very important that we're effective in our approach to be mentors, but above all, have the motivation to have cultural competency training. So I suggest that you reach out to your diversity office or in your department chair and ask for cultural competency training so that you're more aware of individuals' backgrounds, and you can take considerations for these with your emotional intelligence platforms that you're learning. And you can go online, like Dr. Shuler said, to actually take cultural competency tests. And these tests vary based upon who is the person that originating the test. And you will find some of the most simplest tests where they're out of 10, they'll ask you several questions and they'll give you a score, 10 being the highest, 0 being the lowest, and allows for you to see where you're at in the different categories for cultural competency. And so this can allow for you to actually build a framework so you listen to yourself so that you can say, okay, where can I improve at to be more culturally competent? So thank you for your time. I just wanted to get through those last slides a little fast, and I'll hand it back over to Dr. Shuler to start answering questions and to wrap up any key points that I think that I may have missed. So thank you for your time today. Dr. Shuler?
Yes, thank you guys. Are there any questions?
First of all, I just wanted to thank you both so much for your time today and addressing all of these very important topics. We do have several questions in the Q&A, so if folks want to continue to ask those, our speakers would be happy to address those live here. So the first question comes from Barbara. Can the speakers recommend further videos or books on this topic? They're professor in the fall and they really want a good mentor. I know you all mentioned several at the end of your presentation, but if there's any others you would like to recommend, please feel free to do so now.
Um, I'll do one really quickly. So the National Research Mentoring Network has a great book that's by Kristen Funn and Janet Branshaw and also Joy Hansman. And it's called Entering Mentoring. So it's a step-by-step guide that you can do for yourself on how to do mentoring. And then I also would suggest looking back at our PowerPoint for the emotional intelligence books to kind of get you started. And when you have the time, I would suggest asking your chair to actually have cultural competence training that's done by Angela Bias Winston and Kristen Funn. They do a program where they're going around the country to help individuals to really dive deeply into their skill sets to be able to be effective mentors. Dr. Schuler, do you have any other more tools that you want to share with them that you can think of off the top of your head?
Sure. There's a great book by Daniel Goldman on emotional intelligence. And when it comes to mentoring, I believe he also has, excuse me, no, that's not him, it's John Maxwell, has an excellent book on mentoring. It goes from the beginning uh, as a novelist to a senior mentoring. So it actually has a lot of exercises. It has papers or journal articles or studies that has been executed. And so I think those are the two that I would recommend at this time.
Perfect. Thank you both. And the next one is more of a comment than a question, but feel free to address it. It's
Hmm.
from Amelia. She says, making eye contact depends on the mentee's level of comfort and cultural practices as well. Some cultures with eye contact might mean someone is being confrontational.
Well, again, it goes into knowing your audience, who you're going to mentor. So I would not say that goes speaks to the general population. And if it is in a situation where eye contact become offensive in any kind of way, depending on your confidence in yourself as a mentor, I would sit and have a conversation with students who have a problem with eye contact. I am in that space now because I've been doing this now for over 15 plus years, where I can feel comfortable with speaking to students about such issues. If you're not comfortable, then I think maybe you need to bring in another mentor, or maybe have the student to go to a counseling service, or recommend YouTube videos for the individual to watch, or just have a general conversation with a group of individuals, because there is a reason why someone will look at eye contact as being offensive or confrontational, and which goes deeper than beyond the mentor-mentee relationship.
Yes, and then I also want to bring in the kind of perspective from a study that was done in Plus One a while back. It talks about eye contact perceptions in the West and the East. So I think it's something that you have to bring up in the context of how in Western cultures that we're used to here in the United States, if you're in the United States from the call, that we're more expecting individuals to have eye contact. But I can concur with what you're saying in the context of certain cultures where they may think that it can be perceived as rude, as certain Eastern European cultures that are more keen on not having eye contact, or even in some Caribbean cultures as well. But mostly in the Eastern culture, in the context of Eastern Asia, there are a lot of Asian cultures that do not believe having long, drawn out eye contact is appropriate. So that's why we have to ask from the beginning using cultural competence training, not saying, do you want to have eye contact, but ask effectively, how would you like to be mentored? Are there certain practices that you find to be offensive when someone's mentored you in the past? So you can ask questions that are not too probing, but can get some kind of insight in the individual. And I also would suggest taking the time to really send, a message across the lab and kind of, talk about these different practices, and even suggest, instead of doing the traditional journal club, covering some of these concepts in the literature. So for example, this Plus One paper talking about eye contact perception in the West and East, doing that as a review for a journal club and then discussing it so that you can be aware if the individual actually needs to have eye contact or not, or needs to have a certain subset of a specific emotional intelligence skills to be able to be successful. So this is a great question.
Thank you both so much. So the next one comes from Annalise, and she was wondering if you all have a checklist type document for best practices for this topic.
Not necessarily
Not
checklist
necessarily.
that we're going to hand out today, because we're actually we're going to put it in a journal. So
Yes, that's
look
why I was
forward to
laughing.
our journal. We actually almost finished with the article,
Yeah.
and maybe we can share it with the network and they can share it with our audience.
We would
Yes,
absolutely love to share it.
that's why I was laughing. I was we're doing that.
The next one comes from Barbara. If a student manifests an interest in working with you, undergrad science major, what is a good approach for a first meeting, and what kinds of questions should the mentor ask?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, it says if a student manifests an interest in working with you, an
Hmm.
undergrad student or a science major, what is a good approach for the first meeting, and what kinds of questions should the mentor ask that student?
I think this is going to be very brief without going into our work that we're actually about to publish. I think the first thing you should do is actually sit with the mentee, schedule a time, again, a time where you could sit and listen to the mentee without distractions. Give yourself at least 30 minutes to have this conversation. And your first question should be, what are your expectations of me? Meaning, ask the mentee, what is his or her expectation from the relationship? And that should lead into a conversation where you're getting to know whether or not you can fulfill those needs, or maybe you need to bring in another person to help mentor this particular person, or maybe you feel like you can, and you come up with a plan and go from there. Those are my recommendations at this hour.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is more of a comment as well, a question incorporated, but Amelia says that maybe we should update the reaction buttons to be more culturally appropriate. Appropriate. The thumbs up versus okay sign. Just a thought. I think she's referring to those within Zoom platform and maybe on social media as well.
Exactly. We have to go back to when Zoom and other platforms were, they had been in existence way before the pandemic. And so those were the common ones. And so I will agree, they were not, cultures were not considered during the origination of the emojis and all of that. But now they are becoming more sensitive if you log on to certain websites. So if you haven't, if I would suggest you make that suggestion to either your IT people.
It's a great idea. This one comes from Jennifer. What is a good way to ask about life challenges and troubleshoot with mentees? For instance, food insecurities, without being insensitive or coming across as patronizing.
That's a good question. And I say that would take a lot of learning about the person's or the mentee's core values. What are, so I hope I'm taking it, this conversation is between the mentor and mentee. Um, I would say taking time to learn the person's core values. And if there is an issue when it comes up to about food shortages or something of that nature, you need to make sure that you are the person that can talk about this without crossing over into coming to, um, without appearing to be this person that's too far left or too far right. So this is a time that I think I would bring in someone else into the conversation.
Mhm. I agree. That's what I do. So I've had mentees in the past that had situations, and I think it's always bring other individuals into the conversation as long as deemed appropriate. And sometimes things are outside the skill set of the mentor. So what I would encourage you to do is to reach out to your chair to actually be able to maybe suggest counseling for that individual, because we're not able to do everything although we want to. So I just would caution you to not always think that you are able to do it all. Just remind yourself that sometimes certain burdens or certain things we cannot take on as the mentor. Not that it's a bad thing, just we have to be cautious.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. So this next question is from Jennifer. It's pretty similar to the last one asked, but she also wanted to add, about reporting on progress in a less structured environment than an educational system. Do y'all have any feedback on that?
Reporting on a less structured environment.
Correct.
Okay, again, mentoring, whether it's in a structured or unstructured environment, they are very similar up to a certain point. And what I mean by that, in a structured environment like education, there are policies and regulations in place that we all must adhere to. In an unstructured environment, this is where the mentor has a little more control and can set rules and regulation in place. And then you can share those rules and regulations with your mentee. And once they're agreed upon, then the rest fall in the same order. Nothing changes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Um, I have just two more things and then we can wrap up. So I have a comment that says how to approach to become a mentee. I think they are wanting more feedback on how a mentee could approach a mentor.
It depends on, now this is where it depends on the setting. If the mentee is in an educational setting, the mentee can send an email to that individual, or they can ask for a meeting to make such a request in person. And and work in a business sector, sometimes they're a little bit more structured where the mentee, excuse me, the mentor has already been selected for the mentee. If there is a problem, then that is up, it is the responsibility of the mentee to go share with his or her um, report person that this relationship is not working out and ask for another mentee. So it's just about sending either an email, talking face to face, or it it's no correct or wrong way to do such.
Wonderful. Thank you. I know we're after our time, so I just wanted to mention there's another comment in the Q&A asking if these resources could be typed out and sent via email. I would definitely be happy to do so, and I will send everyone a follow-up email with links to the resources mentioned here. With all of
Okay.
that, I would just like to thank you so much for joining us today. And please join us for our future webinars. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter or social media accounts, please do so. Then you can be abreast with all the information coming forth. Um, Thank you so much, Dr. Hinton and Dr. Shuler. The presentation was amazing, and I learned quite a bit myself, so thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone who attended. And just as a reminder, we will be placing this on our YouTube channel, and I'd be happy to send that link to you all via email in a follow-up.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
And I'm getting a lot of positive feedback since y'all are still on the line. Lots of thank yous, lots of praise for a
Oh,
wonderful
wow. Thank you. Thank
Great.
you,
Thank
everyone.
you, everyone.
Thank you so much, guys.